Thank you for coming this evening. I'll introduce myself. I'm your moderator for this evening. My name is Sue Lieberman. I'm Vice President International Policy with the Wildlife Conservation Society, but also very honored to be a fellow of the Zoological Society of London. And in spite of my accent, I do live here in London. And I also have a lot of experience working on big cats, working on wildlife trafficking, working on the intersection between science and policy, and I'm very, very thrilled to be your moderator today, but I'm not the person who's going to be making the exciting presentation. Welcome to the first Science and Conservation event of the 2024-25 program. You will hear from 4 very exciting speakers, followed by questions and answers, and you will have a chance to ask questions. So after the talks or during the talk, if you have a question, please hold on to it, and I'll be able to call on you. So we're going to be talking tonight about big cats and how international policy engagement with governments in these big international summits and fora, how that will benefit the conservation of the species on the ground. Our first speaker is Professor Sarah Durant with the Institute of Zoology here at ZSL. She's a professor at ZSL Institute of Zoology, leads the Africa Range-wide Cheetah Conservation Initiative. She is a renowned cheetah expert. It's not written here, but that's true. She's a conservation scientist, practitioner with expertise in carnivore ecology, conservation, human-wildlife coexistence, landscape conservation, rewilding, and conservation policy. And I've worked with her at many of these international fora. She also has more than 30 years experience in scientific research and conservation of cheetahs and other cats. And since 1991, she has led the Serengeti Cheetah Project in Tanzania, the longest ongoing study of individually recognized cheetahs. Sarah, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the benefits and challenges of international policy for cheetah conservation. And I think cheetahs are a really good example for examining international policy. I'm going to start off by giving you a bit of an overview about cheetahs, so you've got an idea of their ecology and their behavior, because I think that actually gives you an insight into their special needs and their conservation needs. Cheetahs are they're generalists. They range from desert. You can find them in the Sahara Desert, but they can also live in thick bush. They're just excluded from the West and Central African forests, so they live in a wide variety of habitats. They like to eat medium-sized antelopes, so things like impala, gazelle, cob. They're really tasty for cheetahs. That's their favorite prey. But they'll also eat small prey like hares, particularly young cheetahs that are learning to hunt. And then they may eat bigger prey as well, such as wildebeest, particularly males. They do sometimes prey on livestock and obviously farmed game, and that causes conflict. So they can come into conflict with local communities. But cheetahs are really fascinating for many reasons, but they have a really unusual combination of social system and ranging patterns. Only males hold and defend resource-based territories. So most cats you'll think of, they're all territorial. Both the males and females will hold territories that hold all the resources that they need throughout their lives. Whereas with cheetahs, just the males are territorials. And then they also live in groups. So they form these small, permanent coalitions, normally brothers, but not always brothers of 2 to 3 individuals. And then the females are solitary, and they have these big overlapping home ranges, which can be up to 10 times the area of male territories, moving across several male territories during the course of the year. It's a really unusual system. It's not found in other cats, and it's also unique, as far as we know, in mammals. So it's this combination of male sociality and these territoriality and these large female home ranges is very unusual. So what's the reasons for that? Well, cheetahs behave like this because it's an adaptive response, because they live in competition with other large carnivores. So because cheetahs, you'll all know that cheetahs are the fastest land mammal, but that also means they've got very light jaws and they can't defend themselves very easily against other predators. So that means they're easily outcompeted by lions and hyenas, and that limits their population sizes. Now, that's not a problem when cheetahs occur all across Africa, but it becomes a problem when they start getting fragmented because the populations get smaller and smaller. And as they go outside protected areas, then the habitat's not great for them either because they're limited by people. So what that means is you never get very many cheetahs in a particular area. So you get a maximum density of 2 per 100 square kilometers. That's what we've recorded in the Serengeti, which is a really productive habitat. And their home ranges can go up to 3,000 square kilometers or even more. In Serengeti, they're 800 square kilometers, so pretty big even in the Serengeti. What this means is that cheetahs are really vulnerable to threats of habitat loss and fragmentation. So they can really be affected by the fragmentation of their habitat and the loss of their habitat when they get left into smaller and smaller populations. And just to illustrate that, I just want to show you what I mean by fragmentation, what that means for cheetahs. So say you've got a protected area that's reasonably large and it's got a full complement of species. You'll have your ungulates, your cheetah food that will be in high numbers. You'll have some of the big herbivores such as giraffe and elephants. You'll have some of the big predators such as lions. And then you might have a few cheetahs in between, sort of eking out a living alongside the lions and while getting enough food from the ungulates. As soon as you start to split that up, you'll start losing, first of all, you'll start losing the cheetahs. They're the first species that goes as soon as you get into a smaller area of habitat. But you might still have lions. You go even smaller, then you start losing the lions, but you might still have the big herbivores. And if you go even smaller, you'll lose the big herbivores as well. So you could have the same area on the right-hand side, but you'll lose a lot of the species that you would have if the area had been left intact or at least had connectivity between those different fragments. And that's really important for the cheetah survival and for the survival of other big cats as well. They can also be affected by loss of prey, so that can also cause their populations to fragment, so unsustainable hunting, bushmeat extraction, for example, but also grazing competition with livestock can degrade the habitat and reduce the wild prey for cheetahs. And then that can also have knock-on effects with conflict with livestock keepers, as well as game farmers. So many livestock keepers might kill cheetahs as a prevention measure to stop them predating their livestock, or they'll kill them in retaliation. All cats are also threatened by illegal trade for their skins or their parts. Cheetahs face a special threat because they're traded as pets. Particularly cheetah cubs are traded mainly into Middle Eastern markets as pets, and so they face a particular threat due to this trade. So where are we now with cheetahs? Cheetahs are now restricted to 9% of their historical range. They used to occur right across through to Asia. But now the population is less than 7,000 individuals, and they're classified as vulnerable by IUCN. But within that, we've got several very threatened subpopulations, subspecies. In Asia, there's just fewer than 25 Asiatic cheetah remain. They're all in Iran, and they're critically endangered. In the Sahara population is not doing much better, also critically endangered. It occurs in West Africa as well, but still not very many of them left. And then the population I talked about that's traded in the Horn of Africa that goes into these Middle Eastern markets, that's been recently assessed as endangered. So there's a lot of populations that are really doing badly across Africa, even though the numbers are low as well. But there is a good population in southern Africa. So this dark blue area in southern Africa supports more than half of the remaining world's population of cheetahs. And then the only other population, more than 1,000 individuals, is in the East Africa between Kenya and Tanzania. And then there's a few populations more than 100, but most populations are less than 100 individuals. So very fragmented populations with a low chance of survival. But one thing to bear in mind is that actually 2/3 of the remaining cheetah population lives outside protected areas because they need such big areas of land. They can only survive if they occur outside as well as inside protected areas. And there they have to live alongside people. And the total area that they still exist in, that's population of 6,000 plus cheetahs, is 3 million square kilometers. And I think that illustrates that their conservation cheetah, as well as other big cats, needs coordination across really large landscapes and often between countries as well. And I just want to illustrate a couple of examples of some of the work we're doing here at ZSL on what this means for intervening and supporting cheetahs. And the first example I'm going to give you is this small population in Zambia, in Kafue National Park, which is actually disconnected from the big population in southern Africa. And one of the things we're doing is we're working to try and reconnect that population into the Kaza landscape, which is one of the biggest transboundary protected systems on the planet. So we're working with the communities to restore that corridor and restore that connectivity, which means a small population can then disperse into a wider landscape. This is a lot of work. It means community consultations, it means agreements, it means providing support to the communities so they can live alongside wildlife, providing livelihood support, training, capacity development in nature stewardship and land use planning, and working with lots of partners. But it does work with long-term support. Another landscape I want to cover is the Serengeti-Tsavo landscape, which is a different type of land use, traditional pastoralism, but here the problem is unsustainable rangeland management and human-wildlife conflict because there's not much wild prey around, but also a lack of livelihood opportunities, which is leading to increased livestock. This is an area on the border between Tanzania and Kenya, and although it's part of this larger population, more than 1,000 cheetahs, it is quite threatened, and there's a lot of habitat fragmentation occurring in that area. But it is very complicated. There's a lot of different communities, a lot of different land use types, and you've got the transboundary issues as well. And there we're working, well, one thing to bear in mind is this is a stunningly beautiful area as well, so there's a lot of hope for ecotourism in the long term. But there we're working to mitigate conflict, to support livelihoods, particularly with women, developing leather goods, which leather is an easy resource for them, and access to markets, and then also working to develop rangeland management agreements that can secure dry season grazing that then supports wild prey for cheetah, and then also supports climate change resilience for the communities. Again, working with a lot of partners in this landscape. So I think these examples illustrate that landscape scale conservation, which is what these big cats need, really requires grappling with a range of issues, complex governance systems, multiple actors often crossing international boundaries, and the real need for co-management approaches with communities and that real engagement with communities and co-ownership. Alongside multiple implementing organizations, no one organization can do this alone. And this often requires long-term external support that goes beyond project funding cycles, and it requires favorable national and international policies and that political support. And that's where international policy can play a really important role. Countries will meet to agree on the global biodiversity framework at COP16, and there's a range of targets to reduce biodiversity loss. And these are really important targets that can help cheetah and help other big cats. So what are the challenges for international policy for cheetah? One is that we need to move beyond fortress conservation. We need to think of cheetahs living across these multiple use landscapes. We need to prioritize connectivity and transboundary approaches. And we also need to support landscape approaches that can incorporate multiple land uses, so not just protected areas, but having land use zoning that can allow animals to move through areas even though you've still got agriculture, for example, in those regions. And this needs to be supported with community co-management approaches and their co-ownership of any approaches to wildlife management in those areas. And it's really important also to forefront coexistence strategies that generate benefits for human well-being, such as from nature-based solutions. But it's really, these are often very marginalized, vulnerable communities, and they need support for their livelihoods, to develop their livelihoods alongside cheetah conservation. And then I just want to finish up just to say that cheetahs and other big cats, they are resilient species. They can reproduce rapidly and they disperse across large areas. So this wide range they have can be an advantage. All they need is just enough food to eat and to be left alone, and they will come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And please jot down or make a mental note if there's questions you want to ask. I think they just need plenty of food, plenty of space, and be left alone. It's probably true for all the cats. They can breed like cats. They just need to be left alone and have plenty of food and just let them go. And also, I want you to keep in mind some of the points she raised, particularly about connectivity and corridors, because I have a feeling you're going to hear about that on the next species as well. So the next, we're going to hear from Dr. Valeria Boron and Dr. Melissa Arias about jaguars. And although I love cheetahs, I did do field work in Latin America, and I have a soft spot for jaguars. Dr. Valeria Boron has been working at the interface between jaguar science and conservation for over a decade. Her research is focused on jaguars and other cat ecology, conservation priorities, and policy. She has a master's from Imperial College and a PhD from DICE at the University of Kent, and she's currently the WWF UK Senior Program Advisor Latin America and their jaguar lead, conducting scientific research and advising on implementation of jaguar and Amazon projects on habitat conservation, connectivity, human-wildlife coexistence, and trade. And previously, she worked as science coordinator for the Panthera organization and worked for WWF UK. Dr. Melissa Arias, they're sharing a presentation on jaguars, is ZSL's wildlife trade specialist, guiding efforts to combat illegal wildlife trade and promote sustainable, traceable, and legal use, when possible, I would add. Her work bridges the social and natural scientists in addressing wildlife trade and human-wildlife coexistence. Previously, she was the WWF Amazon Jaguar Coordinator and Anti-Corruption Manager, and consulted for the the Convention on Biological Diversity, which will be meeting next month in a few weeks. She holds a PhD from the University of Oxford and a master's from Yale University, and her research is focused on endangered cats in Latin America and Asia. Very august speakers. Please. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue, and good evening, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here and to present about jaguars this evening. Oh, let me share. Our talk would cover an introduction to jaguars, then going into threats, and then, of course, going into policy. I thought the best way to start would be for jaguars to actually introduce themselves to you directly. This is a beautiful jaguar male from our camera traps in Brazil. And jaguars are the third largest cats overall after tigers and lions. They are actually the most aquatic out of the all big cats. They are remarkable swimmers, but they can also climb trees. They can be found across the range in a variety of habitats, from really dry areas and savannas to tropical forests and wetlands. Their diet includes over 85 species. It even includes marine turtles, and recently there was a record of jaguars predating a lemon shark in Costa Rica. So it really makes them very adaptable predators. Their range covers 18 countries, so the importance of cooperation between countries is absolutely key. Their range extends from Mexico to Argentina. They now cover 50% of their historic range, and over 70% of jaguars are in the Amazon, making it such an important stronghold for the species. They're considered near threatened by the IUCN with decreasing population trends. But locally, a lot of populations, and actually all other subpopulations outside of the big green area there that includes the Amazon, are considered endangered or critically endangered. Up until a few years ago, we didn't know how many jaguars we have in the wild, but then recently we were able to collate many different data sets estimating jaguar densities. And then we analyzed how density changes with different variables, and then we were able to extrapolate this across the range to actually get an estimate on jaguar numbers. And that's what we estimated. It's approximately 173,000, so it's a very different situation from cheetah, for example, and a very hopeful situation compared to other big cats. At the same time, it's hopeful, but their populations are declining and threats are increasing. And that's why we focus on jaguars. So their habitat loss is one of the main threats, as cheetahs, jaguars need large areas to survive, and they live at relatively low densities. Habitat loss is mostly caused by agricultural expansion, but more recently we're seeing a worrying trend of forest fires increasing in the region. This is an image taken from NASA from today. So this is current active fires today. We are now in the dry season, and we are seeing dry seasons that are longer and drier. Jaguars are also declining because their prey is declining, and also because of direct killing due to conflict and trade, and Melissa will cover this part in her talk. But at the same time, they have a key roles in ecosystems, really helping with keeping balance and health of ecosystems, and their umbrella species. So by saving jaguars, we save very large areas and all biodiversity within. And just to bring this a bit into perspective on the roles of jaguars as umbrella species, so the jaguar range extends over 9% of the world's land surface, but actually hosts 28% of global biodiversity. It also provides 17% of the world carbon storage and sequestration. And some authors actually tried to assess the value of jaguars as umbrella species, and they concluded that the jaguar network, so this is a network of areas that are important for jaguars, and their corridors actually performs better than random network in protecting high-quality habitats benefiting many co-occurring mammals, so showing that they are an effective umbrella species. Now, jaguars as keystone species, I think more research and evidence is still needed. We can assume they are like any other large predator. There's this study that actually is from a few years ago, and they are showing that when jaguars and pumas are absent from an area, which is what you see on the left-hand side, prey abundance increase, and then plant recruitment and regeneration decreases, so showing an effect of top predators. But top predators don't just have an effect on prey, they also have an effect on other carnivores. And more recently, we published a study with different data sets from Colombia showing that jaguars do have a negative impact on the occurrence of other carnivores, again showing this effect that jaguars have on other species. For all these reasons, jaguars are a priority species in WWF. We have a strategy to 2030, and we work on jaguars across the range, but specifically in 15 priority landscapes. And we work on a range of strategies, from securing indigenous lands and protected areas where jaguar live, to building connectivity, and this really includes working on sustainable livelihoods, on best agricultural practices, and many other things. Also, we work to stop jaguar killing due to, again, trade or conflict, catalyze cooperation, and creating enabling conditions like science and like policy. And really, for such a wide-ranging species, policy and cooperation are extremely important. And one milestone that we were really happy to achieve was the Jaguar 2030 roadmap. This roadmap was launched in 2018, and since then, 16 out of 18 jaguar range countries endorsed this document. It's a very ambitious plan to conserve jaguars across the range. The objective, it actually is to secure 30 priority landscapes by 2030. Conserving jaguars, but also, of course, supporting sustainable developments and therefore meeting globally significant biodiversity goals. As WWF, together with UNDP, WCS, and Panthera, we've supported this landmark agreement, and now we are supporting range country governments to actually implement this roadmap and move towards implementation. We do that through, for example, helping governments access funding to implement this roadmap, but also helping to align these policy documents with other policy frameworks such as CITES and CMS that, again, Melissa will now cover in her talk. And this brings me to the end of the first part of the jaguar talk, and I will hand over to Melissa for the second part.
Thank you so much, Valeria, and I'll continue with the jaguars. So good evening, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here. I am Melissa Arias, and I'm an Ecuadorian conservation scientist, and I work here at CEDESEL as a wildlife trade specialist. And in this short talk, I will be taking us back to 2016, when I was just about to start my PhD here in the UK. And at that time, I was searching for a topic to research, and I remember coming across this news article that described how jaguars were becoming the new victims of illegal trade in their teeth to supply Asian wildlife markets. And because I had been studying tigers during my master's, I was well aware of the high impacts that wildlife trafficking has had over tigers all across Asia, leaving their numbers to just around 5,000 individuals left in the wild. So this news really concerned me and scared me, and I knew immediately that I wanted to dedicate my PhD to trying to learn more about this threat and hopefully find ways to address it. So for my PhD fieldwork, I traveled to Bolivia, Belize, and Guatemala, which were countries that had reports of jaguar trafficking at the time. And I went to remote areas where jaguars still exist, with the hopes of interviewing local communities about their experiences with jaguars and their knowledge about the trade. And I held over 1,000 interviews with the help of an incredible group of research assistants, and I also spoke with wildlife and enforcement authorities. And what I found was really alarming, and this is because the prevalence of jaguar killing and trafficking was a lot higher than I could have ever imagined. So as you can see here, out of the people that I spoke with, almost half had owned jaguar body parts in the past 5 years. 24% had been recruited by other people to kill jaguars. 19% had killed jaguars themselves. 16% had recruited others to kill. 15% sold jaguar body parts. And 13% bought jaguar body parts. Now, 1,000 people may not seem like a lot in the bigger scheme of things, but this sample was representative of other rural villages across Bolivia in this case, And so when we think about jaguars and how they exist in very low densities and they are slow to reproduce, these numbers, these percentages could really have a severe impact in the populations very quickly. Through my interviews, I also learned that there were two main drivers behind this trade. So on the one hand, people were killing jaguars opportunistically and using them domestically for different functional and traditional purposes. So for example, the skins were used to make these kind of wallets or different accessories. They were also used to make furniture, like the jaguar chair that you see. The fat had a wide variety of medicinal uses, from medicine to cure the regular cough to arthritis and rheumatism cures. But what I also found was that with the case of teeth and claws, these were being especially sought after by traders of Asian descent, who were smuggling them to Asia to be sold as amulets or as expensive jewelry pieces. And these items were also being purchased by North American and European tourists in craft markets and fairs, and then taken home as souvenirs. And aside from these commercial drivers, I also learned that one of the underlying motivations behind killing jaguars was that people had negative feelings towards the species. A lot of people didn't like jaguars, they feared them, they thought that they were dangerous, and many people had had negative interactions with jaguars because as people are cutting down forests and replacing them with cattle pastures, displaced jaguars are resorting to eating that livestock, and this generates a very intense and profound conflict with the farmers. Also, a lot of people were not aware that killing jaguars was illegal, and they did not know that they were threatened. So in their minds, there was really nothing wrong with removing a dangerous predator, especially when this predator has a lot of uses and can be sold for a really good price. So once I finished my interviews, I wrote my thesis, I also published some papers, and I shared my results as quickly as possible with the authorities of the countries that I worked in. And at the same time, other researchers and other NGOs started to collect more information about jaguar trafficking in other countries and using other methodologies. For example, they were looking for jaguar parts being sold online on social media or e-commerce platforms, or also they used covert methods and undercover investigations to learn more about the trade. And when we pieced all this information together, we learned the real size and complexity of the networks behind jaguar trafficking. And like me, these other actors also shared their information with the authorities, and this really helped to raise the flag that this was an important issue that could not be ignored. And within the next few years, we began to see governments across Latin America choose the jaguar as their emblem for the fight against wildlife trade and developing national action plans to be able to conserve the species and to react to this illegal trade. And realizing that the trade was a global threat with global markets, they also decided to engage the United Nations in this process. And this takes me back to the present. And now the matter of jaguar trafficking has really become an issue of international policy interest and concern. And jaguar trafficking is being addressed by the UN Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, or CITES, who have produced a comprehensive report describing the characteristics of jaguar trade across Latin America. And they are also in the process of installing an information system to be able to track cases of jaguar poaching and trafficking. CITES has also instructed countries that host jaguar populations to strengthen their legislation and law enforcement controls to protect the species against trafficking. And jaguars are now also covered by the CMS, or the Convention of Migratory Species. And just this past February, the CMS launched a new international agreement entitled the CMS Jaguar Initiative, which effectively will try to secure jaguars from poaching and ensure that jaguars can move across country borders safely and freely. And I will finish by saying that there's still a lot to be done to make sure that these different international frameworks and policies land in changes for jaguars on the ground and are implemented in full. And all the organizations that are part of this panel are actively working to make sure that that happens and to pursue that mission by helping governments. But I hope that this presentation gives you a bit of of hope, really, that research and science can really have a powerful influence over national policies and international policies as well to conserve some of the most emblematic and charismatic species that we have on our planet, which are big cats. And I just want to very quickly recognize and thank all my co-authors and supervisors, Amy, Paola, Pamela, Nuno, Jenny, and EJ, as well as so many different organizations who helped me along the way in the work to address jaguar trafficking. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, and you probably will have questions about trafficking in jaguars or cheetahs, and several of us who are here were certainly able to answer those questions. But one thing I heard, the jaguars still occupy 70% of their former range. Well, 50. I thought you said 70. Oh, okay. The point is the cheetahs are only 9%. We're going to hear about tigers in a minute. So there is hope for cheetahs and tigers, but there's really hope for jaguars. And this international policy work, I would say, has really brought the range state governments together. This isn't some external organization telling them what to do. They're the ones who came to these international meetings and said, we want an initiative. We want to do this. We need your support, world. So there's a lot of good support for jaguars across these countries. Our last speaker, and we won't detract from your time, Paul, is Paul Ornellas, who's the WWF UK Chief Advisor for Wildlife, and he's their technical and policy lead on wildlife issues and oversees the WWF UK Species Program and its wildlife-related work around the world. He's particularly interested in species recovery, conservation planning, and illegal and unsustainable trade, and ecological connectivity. Before joining WWF in 2018, he was here at ZSL for 10 years as part of the Africa team, and he led on illegal wildlife trade and was the CITES, the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species, focal point. He's also a qualified veterinary surgeon, which I didn't know, and I've known him for years. So if you have any pet issues, don't ask him in the Q&A, but afterwards you could ask him. Paul, please.
Thank you, Sue, and good evening, everyone, and it is nice to be back. So, to build on the fantastic talks that we've already had this evening, to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the opportunities and challenges around big cat conservation over the next decade and beyond, particularly from a policy angle. So I'll talk a little bit more on policy and big cats and sort of what we're looking at in that sphere. A little bit more on examples of policy frameworks to support big cat conservation, and then taking a deeper dive into the Convention on Biological Diversity that we've already heard mentioned this evening, before taking a little bit of time to do a bit of a look forward as well. So we've already heard that big cats play a critical role within their ecosystems. We've also heard that they have very particular conservation needs. We've heard about their needs for quite extensive areas of habitat, for wild prey to eat. We know also that they are, in many cases, quite wide-ranging species, so that those habitats need to be connected. We need to look at ecological connectivity and the sort of landscape-level approaches that Sarah was talking about. We also know, as we've just heard, that big cats pose some of the biggest challenges around conflict and living alongside wildlife. And of course, big cats are also threatened significantly still by illegal wildlife trade. And at the same time, big cats resonate with people. We're here this evening talking about big cats. Big cats can also serve as flagships or umbrella species, acting as symbols or surrogates for wider biodiversity. Although, as we've heard, they still remain a threatened group, one of the most threatened group of species globally. And where does policy fit in? We've already heard a little bit, but policy isn't an end in itself. It's a means to deliver things. It provides the foundation for the conservation activities that we undertake, the laws, regulations, plans, that without a strong policy base, we're unable to do the conservation that we need to do. But we do bear in mind that policy is the means, not an end in itself. It relies on many other actions as well, but it forms the basis for us to be able to do those things. So I'll talk on a few examples of where we've used policy frameworks to try and achieve goals around big cat conservation. So from sort of the early mid-70s, countries have come together through sort of global policy mechanisms that have sought to try and address some biodiversity and conservation issues, including around big cats. The first one I want to talk about is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES. There are currently 184 parties or countries that are signed up to the convention, more than 37,000 species listed. And the convention aims to ensure that international trade is sustainable and not to the detriment of the species involved. All of our big cat species are listed on Appendix 1, apart from lions, which means that's the highest protection level. So there's no international commercial trade allowed in those big cat species. And CITES parties have also agreed specific other targeted actions to try and address issues linked to big cats. Just a few examples there around tiger farming, illegal wildlife trade affecting big cats, and improved law enforcement coordination. And whilst legal commercial trade is no longer the significant issue it once was in terms of trade of skins and so on, legally, illegal wildlife trade still remains an issue for all of our cat species, unfortunately. So before tonight, you might not have thought that the Convention on Migratory Species had much role to play for our big cats. But as we've heard from Melissa's talk, CMS, particularly in recent years, is one of the most important policy frameworks to address some of those issues we've heard about, thinking particularly around ecological connectivity and transboundary cooperation. CMS, alongside CITES, is also the host for a couple of relevant species-focused initiatives. We heard already around the jaguar initiative, but there's also an African carnivore initiative that covers 3 of our big cat species as well. Before I come to the Convention on Biological Diversity, I want to talk on other intergovernmental initiatives or forums. These are not UN conventions like CITES and CMS. Examples include the 2010 St. Petersburg Declaration on Tiger Conservation, where tiger range states came together to commit to doubling or to taking the actions that would lead to a doubling of global tiger populations in the wild. And as we've just heard, by 2022, there had been really significant successes around tiger conservation. Now, those achievements were obviously due to a range of different actions that were undertaken by governments and NGOs and communities and others. But the declaration helped catalyze those actions, mobilized support and provided a reference point for the actions that happened since that time. There are a couple of other of these sort of species-focused intergovernmental initiatives. Jaguar 2030 Roadmap we've heard about, and there's also one on relating to snow leopards, the Global Snow Leopard Ecosystem Protection Programme, or the attractively named GSLEP. So, the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. There already existed a number of biodiversity-related global agreements. You see some of the logos in the bottom left corner there, and we've already talked about a couple of them. And they address certain aspects about biodiversity. But it was felt by countries that there needed to be a sort of more comprehensive, overarching agreement to address particular issues for biodiversity as a whole. And in 1992, at the Rio Earth Summit, it was agreed to put in place the Convention on Biological Diversity. At the same time, there was an agreement on the UNFCCC Convention around climate change. So the CBD has 3 objectives. The first, intuitively enough, is conservation of biological diversity, but also sustainable use of biodiversity and its fair and equitable use of its genetic resources. And those 3 objectives carry equal weight within the Convention. The Convention has been ratified by virtually every UN country other than the United States and the Vatican. And those countries have committed to implement the text of the convention and the decisions that come out of subsequent meetings or conferences of the parties. How is it actually tangibly implemented? Countries commit to developing national action plans, or MBSAPs, report on implementation, including tracking specific indicators that we'll come to in just a moment. But obviously implementation depends on the will and capacity of the parties involved. You might also have heard, hopefully, of the Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF. This was adopted in 2022 at the 15th Conference of the Parties, COP15, within CBD, as a plan to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and put nature on the path to recovery by 2050. It has 4 goals and 23 targets to be met by 2030. You can see those targets address drivers of biodiversity loss, nature's benefits to people, and the enabling conditions for the plan to happen. You'll be relieved that I'm not going to talk through all of those, but I have pulled out 5 examples of targets that hopefully will illustrate why, in a meeting talking about big cat conservation, we're also talking about the CBD. So questions there around ecological integrity, targets on restoration, conserving and protecting at least 30% of land, species conservation, use of wild species, etc. And each of those targets has indicators next to it. Indicators around species populations, human-wildlife conflicts, connectivity, etc. So you can start to see how those pieces might fit together for big cats. So we've heard this evening about the issues and challenges facing big cats, and I've also just talked about CBD, the GBF, apologies for the acronyms, and how they can potentially deliver for our big cats. But I would also encourage that we look at it from the other angle, which is that big cats and conserving big cats means conserving so much more. Big cats can serve as indicators of wider biodiversity and ecosystem health. The ranges of cat species overlap with nearly 3/4 of terrestrial key biodiversity areas, and the actions involved in securing big cat conservation help preserve nature's contributions to people, food, water, livelihoods, and a host of other things as well. And of course, big cats can mobilize funds and catalyze wider action for conservation. So yes, delivering on the Global Biodiversity Framework will help deliver for big cats, but we would also argue that the actions needed to deliver for big cats will also help countries meet their commitments around their wider GBF goals. So the bigger commitments around putting nature on a path to recovery will be significantly supported by addressing big cat conservation. And in terms of what happens next with CBD, one of the reasons that we're focusing on it this evening is that next month in Colombia, the next of those conferences of the parties, COP16, is happening when governments and a range of other stakeholders will come together, reviewing progress in implementing this global biodiversity framework, potentially course correct if needed. And what do we as a sort of big cat conservation community want to see at this meeting? Amongst many other things, ensuring that those national plans that we mentioned are strong and integrate the actions we want to see to support big cat conservation. That the mainstreaming of big cats and species conservation more broadly is integrated into the wider framework. You may have seen that target that mentioned species conservation, and yes, that supports species conservation, but across the framework, we want to see the issues around species conservation and big cat conservation be addressed. And of course, that countries actually make good on the commitments they made around mobilizing funds to help deliver all this. So, in my concluding slide, in terms of a look forward, so the challenges around big cat conservation remain. We've heard some of them tonight. Those threats are ongoing, but the tools to address those and the understanding of what's required, we do have those at our disposal. There are also opportunities. Cats represent, or big cats represent flagships for landscape scale conservation. And if I can say it quietly, the word coexistence. Not putting any judgment on what it might mean. And this question of big cat conservation, hopefully we can communicate that it is conservation at scale. Ensuring the connectivity of habitats and ecosystems, the integrity of those ecosystems will deliver for populations of big cats, but also populations of species and biodiversity more broadly. And some of the actions that are involved in terms of sort of looking at that sort of large scale habitat conservation will also help with climate adaptation and mitigation as well. And in terms of the role that policy can play, global conventions like, sorry for the acronyms, CBD, CITES, CMS, can all help provide an enabling environment and help deliver this. So we need to advocate for effective implementation of the policy that already exists, improved policy where it needs to be improved, but particularly that second bullet point, the translation of policy into actual action on the ground, which is where the changes need to happen. And that word mainstreaming again, we need to mainstream and embed big cats across policy frameworks. It's not something that sits on the side as a nice to have. It's actually something that is sort of existential to the whole piece and can deliver on, or help deliver, should I say, on the whole piece. So, if I could leave you with one thought, it's that a focus for us on big cat conservation has significant benefits, not just for big cats, obviously, but also for wider biodiversity, for people, and for climate. And I'll leave it there. Thank you. Oh, that's okay.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you
Shall I
to
shift
all of
along?
our
Okay.
speakers for really exciting talks. If I can ask the speakers to come up, and I think we have people with roving microphones, and I would like to say, as one who's been attending these international conferences probably for more years than I'd like to say, but since the late 1980s, these international policy conferences are a time when governments who may not sit down and talk together about anything, sit down and talk and take decisions on conservation. And governments are not doing enough, and we're all not doing enough, of course. But that's one opportunity when governments kind of a little bit, never enough, but park the politics to talk about conservation, connectivity, and big cats. So that's one reason all of us in our organizations are so engaged with these policy fora. I'm going to ask, just to warm it up, to ask our participants, our speakers, people, all of you listening are motivated, but you're probably thinking, well, there's nothing I can do. There is, other than, of course, give money to your favorite conservation organization, absolutely. I would be remiss if I didn't say that. But other than that, would anybody like to answer? What can people do?
I'll say something. One of the things I think that we can all contribute is to model, I'm going to say that word again, is to model coexistence within our own lives and to have that tolerance for wildlife. So if you've got wildlife coming to your garden, they're digging up or they're eating wires like squirrels or something, just think back and think about what the world would look like if we didn't live alongside wildlife. And I think we all have a role to play in finding a way to live alongside wildlife.
Yes. And if we want people in the Amazon, India, and elsewhere to live alongside wildlife, we also need to be willing to live alongside the wildlife here in this country, in my opinion. Anyone have a question?
Thank you. I was just saying I'll kick off if no one else wants to. I'm Ray Heaton, ZSL Fellow. I think the Jaguar roadmap is incredibly encouraging and taking account of those subpopulations. I don't know how different those jaguars are. I don't want to be too wide-ranging in my question. I'm about halfway through. But I'm concerned and interested to know if with the tigers, not just in India, but in Southeast Asia, if there is any possibility, I know there are huge problems in India, we've been told, is there any possibility of working towards something like that, accepting that we have different species of tiger in several parts of Asia? How can these two things catalyze one another, maybe? I don't know.
The challenges are of scale. They're of scale and abundance and scarcity. We don't have 200,000 tigers. They're not as wide-ranging or they're not as widespread as jaguars are. A lot of Asian countries, particularly my own country, isn't friends with our neighbors. Yeah. So working relationships are hampered because of troubled political histories. The other thing is that, there was a reclassification of tigers based on genetics recently, and all tigers that live in the the continental Asia are reclassified as one species. So there are opportunities of connectivity there, but there aren't as many tigers left. And if the populations come back, they can repopulate. There's around 3 million square kilometers of forest that currently does not have tigers or could have tigers. So that could be a thing in the future, but we'll have to wait quite a bit.
I would add that whole issue of connectivity. We may never reconnect all, we never will reconnect all tiger habitats from Siberia to Sumatra. But I think there's still a lot of work going on to increase whatever connectivity is possible. In the case of the jaguar, there's opportunities, the roadmap's incredible, and it's also about connectivity that exists. Make sure it isn't destroyed. As development continues and roads and whatever, make sure that governments put in place policies to at least keep the connectivity they have and work to increase it. But you're right, the Jaguar roadmap, if you want to comment any further, is really amazing. And it is a product of the conservationists who worked with governments, but those governments have all endorsed moving forward on it. If you want to say anything further?
Yeah, no, and I think there's great opportunities, as you said, for like tigers and jaguars, for like learning from each other. And one thing I was thinking, we have the roadmap, and that's an amazing milestone, but we can really learn from the tigers range countries on how they managed to double tigers' numbers. So from a framework to implementation, as Paul was saying, policy is a means to an end. So how can we really work on the basis of the roadmap to ensure implementation and growth of jaguars while ensuring development and coexistence with people?
Other questions? There, one over there, please.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for the talk. All of them, they're really wonderful. I think it's great that we're able to be here. My question is about incentives. And I think a lot of us sitting here would love to see conservation for its own sake. But I think when it comes to the global stage, when you've got nations, they have other incentives pulling them in other directions. For example, a lot of people spoke about economic activity and farmland and sort of moving into some of the habitats of these big cats. So what are some of the incentives and disincentives that can be applied for these countries to make them want to do the conservation?
Anyone want to take that? Go ahead, Paul.
I think that really gets to the nub of some of the framings that we're trying to make around not just big cat conservation, but conservation more broadly, is understanding that there are potential trade-offs, there are different pressures, and looking at ways in which we can provide the evidence and articulate why conserving big cats does actually deliver not just the presence of big cats, but can support these other topics. And as mentioning that when, for example, you're talking about looking at habitat protection at scale, if you're talking about tropical forests, for example, they will provide all sorts of other services and benefits to people. And those could be around food, watershed protection, a whole host of other things. So it's about framing the conservation of big cats as something that contributes so much more. But there's no getting away from the fact that at times there are trade-offs around whether it's development or climate or biodiversity, and looking at ways that you can find optimal scenarios that can deliver the best gains across that spectrum. But it is a challenge.
Yeah, I would also make the point that if we're looking at climate change, and we have to look at climate change, we can't ignore climate change, we will not solve climate change without biodiversity, without nature, without forests. So when we talk about protecting forests and the habitat for big cats, we also need to communicate that that is key to mitigation of climate change as well. I don't know if we're going to end up solving the climate problem or not, but in addition to reducing CO2 and greenhouse gases, we have to protect biodiversity. We have to protect what's left. And the big cats are key to that because it's their habitats that we have to protect. And sometimes it's easier to communicate habitat protection, and sometimes it's easier to communicate we need to save the jaguar. therefore we'll save the forest. So I think it's about looking at all of those issues really holistically. Someone had there.
So fascinating talks, but I'm hearing it's like, it seems almost contradictory. On the one hand, we're talking about these global targets of doubling numbers or increasing range sizes, but on the other hand, we're also talking about, people coexisting with wildlife and doing this in a myriad of ways, and with ancient traditions involved and indigenous rights and things. How can we reconcile these kind of two different approaches? On the one hand, a kind of very localized and probably complex association with wildlife, but also these kind of global targets. Is there conflict in the ways of scaling up the local arguments to global scale?
I don't mind answering that. I think we need an increase in community-managed protected areas. Because if you've got protected areas that are managed, owned by communities that deliver on conservation, on biodiversity and climate change targets as well, then they can secure resources because of that delivery, and then they also have the ownership and they have the co-management of those protected areas. And I think we need to rethink how we think about protected areas, that these sorts of protected area models, they work in many areas and they can be increased.
And perhaps just adding on to what Sarah just said, several of these conventions that we spoke about are recognizing the importance of local communities in the implementation of these actions. So they're taking steps not only to invite them to participate to the decision-making events, but also to make specific decisions that incorporate their views into the policy making. Because in the end, it is all about how they then live with these animals and make the decisions in their day-to-day lives to live in a convivial way. So yeah, there's this element of bringing them to the decision-making level.
Go ahead, Paul.
Just to add as well is some of those sorts of global level policies and targets could also complement some of the local level actions. So for example, if you're looking at trying to address some of the drivers of habitat loss, degradation, fragmentation, which is sort of highly significant, some of those could be addressed efforts could be made at the global level to try and sort of look at how some of those big drivers in terms of financial flows and agriculture and planning and so on can be addressed, and those can complement those sorts of community-driven local level solutions as well.
I would add one thing to that the threats to global biodiversity, the reason biodiversity is collapsing is not because of indigenous communities, peoples, and it's not because of local communities. It's because of our collective, if you will, exploitation of wildlife, the food systems, the people want cheap beef, they want other meat. It's the whole global economic system. Obviously, we can't solve that today, but I think we need to learn from the indigenous peoples. They're not the reason that species are endangered. Whether it's in India, whether it's in the Amazon basin, there are vast areas that are managed by indigenous peoples, and other places that indigenous peoples we need to recognize and give them their rights back to manage their lands and waters. But it's the global economic system, we call it development, I call it exploitation. That's what needs to change. There really needs to be a transformation in that if we're going to save our planet and if we're going to save our big cats. It's my personal opinion, but I don't see it as a conflict. I think it's more we really need to look at the entire economic system of what's driving the destruction, and that's not the indigenous peoples at all. Yes, there's a question. There are two questions in the middle.
Hello. So my question is, we're talking about different communities that live alongside large, dangerous animals, and some of them seem to have a respectful and good image of them and living alongside them, and some of them seem to have really bad image and want to hunt them down because they're dangerous. Do you think there's anything, like any pattern of why some communities have one attitude and others lean to other attitudes?
Anyone?
I think the relationships that communities have had with wild animals are as diverse as the communities themselves. And that diversity is not just across communities, that diversity is also reflected in different species that communities have relationships with. So that's the baseline. It was always very diverse. It was always complicated. But where what I want to stress is that there's discontinuity in a lot of those relationships, and those relationships have been entirely transformed through impacts of large-scale industrial extraction, through massive colonization and removal of traditional practices, and through annexation and appropriation of a lot of these cultures. This is not to say that there was ever a pure culture that where everything lived happily ever together, but it is to say that a lot of things that we see today aren't what they always were, and a lot of communities are responding to many other pressures when they interact with animals.
Yeah, perhaps I can add a little bit to that. We call them local communities, but really they are so diverse in their backgrounds, their origins, their beliefs, their ways of thinking. And for the case of jaguars, I was talking about the negative perceptions that there is, and you do see a wide-ranging variety of perceptions, even within the same villages in where I worked. But I think it is what we were saying, that there sometimes is a loss of culture as new generations come. Sometimes their ancestors, the new generations may not learn the same things as their ancestors did, and they're even more so influenced by social media or by the internet or learning new things. So they will see the predators as an animal that comes and takes the livestock without necessarily going back to all the history of coexistence. So it's also a matter of how can we bring those stories back and reignite those cultural aspects as well within communities.
Please.
Hi. Just a question on education side of things, really, for people that are in positions of power that don't want to listen. For example, one of the presidential candidates for the United States has continuously stated that climate change is a hoax, and that it doesn't affect anything, and it's just the weather. And obviously, as you said earlier, in India, the government and bureaucrats don't tend to understand that tigers are wild animals and will move in and out of reserves. How do you educate people that are in that sort of position but just don't want to be educated?
Very easy question. How do we change the world?
Start young.
It's not going to be a very hopeful answer, but these are very deeply entrenched systems of power. And a lot of these folks I think there are two kinds of folks: those who know better and still will not believe it because it impacts their bottom line, which is business and profit making. And then there's those who legitimately have a different value system and a belief system. Both groups, I think, are very difficult to influence. I personally don't have a recipe for that, but that's where I'll let others chip in.
I'll just...
Go ahead. You have a microphone. I don't need, well, you can just stand here.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking.
Or use his.
So much. No, just on it, maybe just to add a little bit of hope. I think the private sector, some of that business, we are seeing change. So some of these political leaders that will not necessarily listen to NGOs saying, oh yeah, climate change is real, but the private sector, I think, is starting to move towards responsibility, some companies, into commitments, into having to deliver those. So once I think the private sectors moves more towards those commitments, then that will influence political leaders. We are seeing some changes. but it's a long way, long road.
But I think education is important, and I think also communicating, we live in a democracy, communicating with our political leaders and decision makers as well on these issues. You have a right to do that. I believe we all have an obligation to do that. So I think that's extremely important. I will be at the meeting in Cali, and I hope to see the UK government there and see what they have to say. But I would like to wrap it up and thank the speakers for really exciting talks. Thank all of you for being here, for your interest, for your questions, and please let us know what you thought of today's event, and there's going to be a questionnaire or something when you leave, and thank you for coming, and have an easy journey home. Thank you.